May 13th, 2026. Here's what changed overnight in the environmental regulatory landscape. Alberta pipeline project now contingent on federal-provincial agreement on industrial carbon tax. Alberta and federal officials have tied a new West Coast pipeline to resolution of industrial carbon pricing. British Columbia has advanced 6 clean electricity projects to cut emissions at industrial sites. Environment and Climate Change Canada is directing research funding toward plastic pollution effects on Indigenous communities. Alberta and Canada have conditioned approval of a new pipeline to the West Coast on reaching agreement on the industrial carbon tax. The linkage directly affects project economics for any proponent advancing linear infrastructure under the Impact Assessment Act and Alberta EPEA. Prior pipeline applications treated carbon pricing as a separate compliance stream. The current arrangement folds tax outcomes into the overall permitting decision. Consultants preparing environmental impact statements for oil and gas corridors must now model multiple carbon price scenarios in their net present value and risk assessments. Field teams should update greenhouse gas quantification protocols to align with the latest federal draft guidance on industrial emissions. Watch for the next federal-provincial meeting outcome, which will determine whether the project proceeds to detailed regulatory review or requires redesign. In British Columbia, the government has approved funding for 6 Made in BC clean electricity projects. These projects target facilities already subject to provincial greenhouse gas reporting and potential future performance standards under the Environmental Management Act. Proponents of new or expanding operations should review eligibility criteria this week to determine whether on-site electrification can offset anticipated carbon costs. The federal government is funding 6 research projects examining plastic pollution impacts on Indigenous communities. Results are expected to inform future CPA risk assessments and potential additions to Schedule 1 toxic substances. Practitioners conducting site investigations near northern or coastal communities should incorporate microplastic sampling into baseline programs where sediment or surface water pathways exist. The Alberta-Canada Pipeline Agreement introduces new uncertainty into project schedules and capital planning for any proponent relying on federal or provincial approvals. Environmental consultants should prepare sensitivity analyses that treat carbon tax levels as a variable input rather than a fixed compliance cost. Early engagement with both Alberta Environment and Protected Areas and the impact assessment at GMIC is now advisable for any linear project crossing provincial boundaries. If you are working on pipeline or linear infrastructure environmental impact statements in Alberta, review the latest federal draft industrial carbon pricing guidance for direct implications. Update internal remedial options analysis templates to include multiple carbon price scenarios when modeling thermal or energy-intensive technologies in Western Canada. Brief clients on the BC Clean Electricity Funding Program for any industrial site considering on-site generation or grid upgrades to reduce emissions liabilities. Incorporate microplastic sampling protocols into baseline surface water programs for sites near Indigenous communities where ECCC-funded research may influence future CPA listings. Monitor federal-provincial discussions on industrial carbon tax for pipeline projects. Any agreement could trigger immediate impact assessment agency process updates. Track ECCC release of initial findings from the 6 plastic pollution research projects for potential additions to CPA Schedule 1. Review BC Clean Tech funding intake deadlines for electrification projects that may qualify under current provincial emissions performance standards. Now, speaking of carbon price sensitivity in remediation cost modeling, Consider a former upstream oil and gas battery in Alberta, where the Phase 2 ESA has delineated a 1.2 hectare plume of PHC F2 and F3 in fine-grained till. The client's internal model assumes a fixed $50 per ton carbon price for the thermal desorption option. Yet the federal-provincial pipeline talks signal that industrial rates could rise sharply within the project timeline. In the field, this means the remedial options analysis must now run parallel cost curves at $50, $80, and $120 per ton. Each increment changes the break-even point between excavation and in situ chemical oxidation. The experienced practitioner notices that carbon pricing also indirectly affects disposal facility gate fees and transportation surcharges. These items are rarely flagged in standard CCME Tier 2 worksheets. The insight that separates senior from junior work is recognizing that the carbon tax applies not only to on-site energy use, but to the embodied emissions of imported reagents and off-site treatment. The mistake I see most often is locking the remedial design to a single carbon price assumption in the initial options analysis. The fix is to require the cost model to carry 3 discrete carbon price scenarios through to the final recommendation table submitted under EPEA. Tomorrow, watch for any federal-provincial agreement on industrial carbon tax that could immediately alter impact assessment agency timelines for pending pipeline projects. That covers today's environmental intelligence. If you found this useful, share it with a colleague who needs to stay current. We're back tomorrow morning. This episode used AI voice synthesis of my voice. Editorial selection and analysis are my own.